It requires a very targeted policy, a dedicated policy that will actually guide the economic growth as well as help in improving the environment. So the industrial economics says that until you reach this peak, there has been a continuous environmental degradation. You have been trying to destroy the environment as far as possible. People do spend that money. Why? Because they have now come to the level where they can afford to have a better environment, a cleaner and greener environment. Good morning and welcome to the second session in Chapter 1, Sustainable Development in B.C.A, where we are going to talk about the environmental Kuznets curve. Now, this is a very important topic. Why? Because the environmental Kuznets curve suggests that there is an economic development that initially leads to the deterioration in the environment, as we were speaking about economic development on one side and deterioration on the other side. Yes, they are linked, and that was actually given by an economist named Kuznets. But after a certain level of economic growth, a society begins to improve the relationship with the environment and the levels of environment degradation reduces. Now, this is something very important for all of us to understand. Initially, any society in this world would try to make economic development by destroying the environment. That's what has been happening in most of the developed countries. But once they have developed and they have come to some level, to some range altogether, the concern goes back to that same environment which actually paved the path to the economic growth. So that's where the relationship is what we are going to understand in this particular chapter. Now, from a very simplistic viewpoint, it can be suggested that economic growth is good for the environment. Definitely, yes. But then the critics argue that there is no guarantee that economic growth will lead to an improved environment. In fact, the opposite is always possible in this case. So at least it requires a very targeted policy, a dedicated policy that will actually guide the economic growth as well as help in improving the environment. Now, normally what happens is that people say that though we recover back in terms of the economic growth, we will definitely come back and improve the environment. But 90% of the time it so happens that we get very busy in our life. We get very busy in counting the money, the monetary expansion, the asset expansion, that we forget about the environment. So most of the time it happens in such a manner that we just forget the environment, and it leads to a total degradation in the long run. There is argument in terms of understanding this environment versus economic growth. So most of the people suggest that unless and until there is a proper regulation, rather a strict regulation, which can direct the policy towards development and growth in a most targeted manner, then only we will be able to speak about it, we will be able to take it forward altogether. Followed by the Kuznets curve diagram. Now just look at the diagram. What does it try to say? Now you see the level of environmental degradation first. That was at a peak during the pre-industrial economics. So the industrial economics says that until you reach this peak, there has been a continuous environmental degradation. You have been trying to destroy the environment as far as possible. All of a sudden, what happens is that once you have reached the peak, you would start getting back to a scenario called as the post-industrial based economy. Now what happens is that since you have got saturated in terms of economic growth, you want to go and concentrate back onto the environment. So that's where you would be seeing that the GDP per capita growth will start increasing, no doubt about it. But at some point of time, the GDP comes down, the importance at that level comes down, and we want to go back to the environmental growth. Now, the causes for environmental factor, that is the Kuznets curve, the first thing is the empirical evidence that we are going to talk about in terms of the declining pollution with the economic growth altogether. Now, when you start seeing that, studies at the higher economic growth in US led to the increased use of cars, but at the same time, due to regulation, levels of air pollution, particularly that of sulfur dioxide levels, declined. Now, this is very important. Why? Because When you start understanding the Kuznets curve altogether, they say it very, very clearly here that though economic growth has started propelling the usage of technology, the usage of gadgets, usage of automobiles, but as the country makes an economic progress, most of the country also start understanding what are all the problems that are created in the society because of the environmental degradation. So United States took a step immediately in order to reduce the air pollution. They started coming up with more environmental friendly vehicles. They started promoting the policy of non-polluting vehicles in the society. They reduced the sulfur dioxide content in the air. So slowly what happened is that one side they were able to justify their economic growth, and the other side they were able to come back and say they had the concern for the environment. Followed by, when we talk about the next level of this Kuznets curve, spare income with growth. Now, this is a very, very important point which I would like to talk about. With higher rates of economic growth, people have more discretionary income after paying their basic necessity. Therefore, they become more amenable to pay higher prices in return for a better environmental standard. Now, just look into this factor. The cost of living in Switzerland, or the cost of living in Austria, or probably the cost of living in Germany, Finland, or any other the Scandinavian countries, or the Scottish zones altogether is definitely higher than living in India. But people do spend that money. Why? Because they have now come to the level where they can afford to have a better environment, a cleaner and greener environment. Which means now what happens is that the money that you have raised, the money that you have earned by the spur of economic growth, by the turnover of the economic growth altogether, now you want to make use of that economic growth, the money that you have raised, back to the environment. You want to go back to the place where environment is neat, it is clean and green, and you're ready to pay a price for it. That's exactly where Kuznets come back and says that spare the income with growth. So you are ready to shell out your income for a better environment altogether. So that's the second part of the story. The third thing, focus on living standards as opposed to the real GDP. Now, GDP is one word in economics which everybody is fancied about. No doubt about it, because that actually is the marketable story for any of the economy. Moment you talk about GDP, you talk about those numbers, the figures that splashes across the pages of newspaper or on your TV screens altogether. That really pushes the image of the country, no doubt about it. But in reality, let's try to understand that more than the real GDP and the rates of economic growth, there is a growing awareness, a link between economic growing and living standards. Now that is more important, though India is a country which has been making a rapid stride in terms of industrialization, in terms of development, in terms of activities. But then the question that comes back to the minds of people is that, what is the living standard in India? Because the living standard is not a common pattern across our country. You cannot say that the way people live in Delhi is the same way people live in Jammu and Kashmir. Or the way people live in Gujarat is not the same way how people live in Manipur or Mizoram. So now what happens is that one side, when you talk about those greenish figures or numbers in GDP, but the other side, you will be talking about the real life standards, which is quite contrasting. So the Kuznets curve comes back and makes you focus on the factor that, forget the numbers, let's concentrate on the real living standards. Let's concentrate on the actuality. So that's where this is the third important point that we are discussing today. Followed by the improved technology. The primary driving force but behind the long-term economic growth is improved technology and higher productivity. No doubts about it. Why? Because technology is something that has become more or less a habit. It has become a part and parcel of our life, and we cannot give up on technology. You can't say people go back to the Stone Age. Now, people want to progress in life, and to progress, technology becomes an integral part of their life. Now, the second thing is that with higher productivity, we can see higher output with less raw materials used. So, for example, since 1950s, the technology of car that has been used has significantly improved the fuel efficiency, no doubt about it. So, what we are trying to say here is that The improved technology itself is one of the propellant towards the environmental condition that we are living. Now, with the introduction of EV vehicles, that is the electric vehicles in India, we are rather going back for a better fuel efficiency, we're going for a better standard of living, a better driving condition, and all those facts. So what is going to happen is that the combination of technology, when it gets imbibed into the society, this is definitely going to carry us forward to greater heights as far as possible. Now, the next thing is that in 1950s, many cars had very low miles per gallon. That was quite common. But in the recent years, the manufacturers have made a huge success by improving the technology, by getting onto a cleaner hybrid state of technology, hybrid state of the factors altogether, which is now driving your mileage to the next level as far as possible. So today when people talk about a 25 kilometers per liter or 30 kilometers per liter, this is not something a fancy story, this is not something a lie, but this is something which is happening right now before your eyes because we have been able to harness the technology to that extent. Followed by the solar and renewable energy, a very good example of how improved technology has reduced the potential for environmental damage is the progress of the solar technology that we have been speaking about. Now, when you look into the solar world altogether, though we were the people who have believed in the science of solar energy, but still there was a time when we actually deviated from the solar energy and started concentrating too much on the fossil. But today, the circle is back. It has taken a U-turn. It has come back again to the same point where we have started harnessing the natural goodness of the solar energy that has been given to us in abundance. So what is happening here is that by using solar energy in respect of clean and green energy, what we are able to do, we are able to reduce the damage towards the environment, which itself I would definitely say is a very big achievement that we have achieved in the recent years altogether. So this is something that we have to really appreciate, that we have to really take it forward. Followed by the deindustrialization. Initially, the economic development leads to the shifting of farming to manufacturing. That was how India was typically looking into, because I look at this example more to a Indian context. Initially, we were more a farming-based country, agriculture-based country. We shifted our ideology to industrialization, as you see here, and this actually led to a greater environmental degradation. But after the late 90s, let's say in the late 2000s altogether, what has been seeing is that people again want to go back to the agriculture. Today, they want to go back to the organic farming. They want to go back to a system where they can create a cleaner and greener environment for their generations to come. So what we are able to see here is that as you start going lower on industrialization and you tend to start going back to the same circle of agriculture farming with an improved technology and better resources altogether, you are creating a positive impact towards the environment. Now, the other factor is that an economy like UK has been seeing that industrialization shrinking as a share of the economy. The service sector has usually a lower environmental impact. Now, you would be able to see that UK, which is one of the most advanced developed economy in the world, suddenly there has been a shrink towards the industrialization. People don't want to go again on the same topic. They don't want to again create a textile manufacturing company, a nut and bolt manufacturing company, or an automobile company there at any point. But rather what has happened is that they have started thinking about environmental based industries. They have started their focus to shift towards the services sector altogether. The other thing is that the role of government regulation, which I would say is a very big impact that is coming into picture. Economic growth and development of a nation is primarily because of the governmental inclusion towards the GDP. But now the government is able to implement taxes and regulation in order to solve the environmental problem. So they've gone really hard upon to tell people that if you are found polluting the environment at any given point of time, if you are found doing something which is not acceptable to the societal norms, if you're found doing something which will cause harm to the environment, then you will be penalized. So now what is happening is that a regulation is actually trying to set the clock back and get the environment on track. So this is something which is very, very important analysis done by the Kuznets curve altogether. Now, the other thing is that the diminishing marginal utility of income, you can just have a look into the graph altogether. Now, the first 10,000 that you are going to earn will be a greater benefit. But as you start earning more and more, when the income rises from that of a 90,000 to 1 lakh, the gain is limited. What I try to say here is that at the initial level, people will try to make the maximum utilization of gain in income. Nobody is going to deny that factor. Why? Because you find that every single rupee that's going to come into your pocket is definitely going to be a great benefit. You're going to make the best use of it. You're going to buy things, you're going to spend on it, and you're going to make your life even more luxurious, comfortable as far as possible. But beyond a point, what happens is that once you have achieved the level of satisfaction, once you have felt that yes, enough is enough, even though the income starts raising, but the marginal utility will decline. You don't want to see an extra gain out of it. So you slowly start coming down the curve in terms of marginal utility. Followed by the criticisms that we are going to talk about. One thing is the empirical evidence is mixed. There is no guarantee for economic growth that is being seen here. And when I say that economic growth will definitely go and finally you will see environment coming back, we don't have any particular evidence for it. Pollution is it's not just a function of income, but then if you start seeing this, it's because of population level also, it is because of traffic, so many other factors. So you cannot say that pollution is primarily caused only by population. There are other factors also. So this theory also gets defeated at times here. Followed by the global pollution. Many of the developed countries across the global have seen a reduction in industry and growth, no doubt about it, in service sector, but still they are importing goods from the developing country. In fact, if I have to bring in the example of India here again, one side when we talk about a digital economy and e-economy, but the other side there has also been a push given to the manufacturing setup. We are also talking about startups. We are also talking about that deficit which is happening in terms of imports and exports. So at a given point of time, I would say that this theory cannot be completely accepted as truth. Second thing is that pollution may reduce in UK, US, but the countries where we are going to see about the export of these countries, for example, whenever we see those developing countries coming into picture, definitely the pollution levels have not come up, rather they have gone up altogether. Followed by one of the examples with regards to deforestation that I'm going to talk about. Higher income countries tend to stop the process of deforestation, no doubt, but at the same time, they still import meat and furniture who are creating farmland out of the forest. So which means to say that though your country is protected, but some other country is getting destroyed. Somewhere else, people are cutting the trees, people are chopping the animals, and the meat is getting processed, the furniture is being made. So somewhere else, the degradation is happening. This is not a uniform theory that has been practiced across all the countries of the world. This is not something, a uniform law that has been taken up by every single country. So one side, when you talk about the greenish part of it, the rosy part of it, but the other side, there are factors, there are backlashes in this theory. And the other thing is that growth leads to greater resource use. Somebody says that, when you argue on the degree of the reduced environmental factors that we are talking about, but if the economy continues to expand, which is quite evident altogether, now you can't expect China to be on the same pace altogether or India to be on the same pace. 10 years down the lane, the economy can expand and there might be a greater measure altogether. If in that case, in that condition, again, there will be an environmental degradation coming into the picture. So we can't stop it. I don't mean to say here that this will get completely reduced and the theory will be accepted. This will continue and there will be an environmental degradation altogether. The other thing is that countries with the highest GDP levels also have the highest carbon emission, which is quite evident that we have been able to see that. Now, for example, Ethiopia has got a lesser carbon emission when compared to US, when compared to China. Why? Because the industrialization or the GDP levels are pretty much low. So this definitely goes against the theory of Kuznets. And coming to the conclusion part of it, the link between the income and environmental degradation is quite weak, so we are not going to accept this theory. And it is possible that economic growth is always not compatible with that of environmental growth altogether. It is not going to happen that after the economic growth, I'm going to rethink about the environment and I'm going to come back and make it green altogether. Now, for a very, very deliberate situation, even though the government steps in and says that you have to do it, but still, you will not be able to see a complete 100% success in terms of restoring the economy back to green. So definitely, Kuznets curves has got some backdraws, which we have to accept it. And these are some of the factors that we have to take it with it. So though this theory throws light on in terms of the economic development and environment, but the drawbacks are quite evident. So I would also say that we have to weigh the pros and cons in this particular theory. With this, I come to the end of today's session. I hope and believe that all the resources that have been shared through this particular session will be beneficial both in terms of theory as well as in terms of your practical learning in daily walk of life. In the next session, we will be talking more about the different aspects of environmental economics. But until then, stay tuned, stay blessed, and stay enlightened forever. Thank you once again for joining me today on this wonderful session.